Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a wrap-up of some of the recent fiction that I've read. I'm going to start off with a book that I talked about a bit when I did the mid-year freakout tag the other day, and that is P. Djèlí Clark's The Black God's Drums. This is set in New Orleans in the US Civil War era, but it is an alternative universe in which some advanced weaponry of a steampunk variety was introduced into the conflict, which resulted in a stalemate or a ceasefire, and New Orleans is a neutral port. And this story is about some Confederate officers who have stolen a Haitian scientist, and people need to get him back so that this war doesn't restart. The main character in this is a young girl who has a Yoruba god living alongside her in her mind. Not exactly a possession case, but just the two of them are sort of in conversation and sharing the body. And she meets up with a woman who is a Trinidadian steampunk pirate, somebody who flies an airship, and you can just imagine the prosthetic leg that's described being ultra steampunk. And they meet up, they sort of know each other because the captain used to be sexually involved with the girl's mother. And anyway, this captain also has a different god living in her head, and the two of them team up to stop this war from restarting. It is an entertaining romp. Do you want to see steampunk New Orleans? Of course you do. Because this is a novella, because it is so short, there are some character pieces that could have been drawn out more if this had been a longer work. It's not as a weakness of the format, more so than a weakness of the story itself. But with that kind of thing, your mileage may vary as to whether you would rather have had something that's 50 pages longer, or you just enjoy this for what it is. I thought this was an entertaining romp, and I am looking forward to picking up more of this author's work now. I also read another novella that was also speculative fiction, and that was Ashante Wilson's A Taste of Honey. This is set in the same universe as his earlier novella, The Sorcerer of the Wild Deeps, which I really enjoyed. It had a lot of really interesting language play in that one. This has some of that, but not to the same extent, which I was a little bit disappointed with, maybe unfairly, because I did so enjoy the way that book played with different registers of language and with different forms of code switching between registers of language and also between languages themselves. This is a more straightforward story. We have a man who marries into royalty. In his youth, he had an affair with a man from a different culture. That relationship ended, but it sort of stayed with him for the rest of his life, and his wife eventually goes off to be a space physicist, sort of. It follows him over the course of his life while flashing back to this short relationship that he had in his youth. It's an entertaining enough story, and as I said, it's more straightforward than the earlier one, but I thought The Sorcerer of the Wild Deeps was a lot more interesting, and because I went in expecting something that would be a little bit more experimental in that same style, I was a little disappointed with how straightforward this is, but I think that will make this more appealing to a lot of readers. So, if you read The Sorcerer of the Wild Deeps and thought it was a little too weird, you might enjoy this one more. It was still an entertaining story. I almost wish I had read this first so that then the other book would be more of a surprise. But still, entertaining, and again, it's a novella, so I don't have a lot to say about that. Sticking with genre novellas, but jumping genres, I also read a romance novella, and that was Courtney Milan's Mrs. Martin's Incomparable Adventure, which is a story in her Worth saga, which are a series of period romances. This is surprising for romances. I feel like they're normally relatively young people, and the two characters in this are quite elderly. This is a story about a 69-year-old woman who's just lost her job, and she's going to try to slightly scam a rich 73-year-old woman into helping her, and romance ensues between the two of them. Now, because it starts out with this deception, I spent a good 2/3 of this story waiting for that to be the mark, because as all romance novels do, you have this dramatic event that happens 2/3 to 3/4 of the way through the story. So because we start with this deception, I expected that to be the drama point. It's not, which might be a bit of a spoiler, but I mention that because I loathe that trope so much that I was dreading that this very entertaining story was going to head to this kind of drama. And that it doesn't meant that I was dreading it for nothing, and I think I would have enjoyed this significantly more if I had known that that wasn't where we were heading and wasn't dreading it the whole way around. because this is surprisingly entertaining. It does deal with some kind of heavy topics because these are women who are single in their late 60s, early 70s, in a period where women don't necessarily have a lot of rights. The rich woman has a nephew who's always threatening to have her declared incompetent, and they do some scheming. It's an entertaining romp. There is a sex scene which surprised me more than it probably should, because why shouldn't an elderly couple have this love scene? Why not, right? So I was pleasantly surprised by this in a lot of ways, because I think it called me out on my assumptions about what a romance between a couple of 70-year-old women would be like, and it's just a normal romance, even though it's aware of their age, and yeah. So yeah, it was entertaining. I have not read any of the books in the rest of this series that this is connected to, so I can't tell you what characters showed up or not, but I was entertained, but I would have been more entertained if I hadn't been dreading this thing that didn't actually happen. So next up, I also read 2 books that are set in my neighborhood. The first of which is Mathis Bailey's Confused Spice. Mathis Bailey used to be a booktuber. His channel is still active, although he hasn't posted for a while. I will link to that below. Hilariously, in terms of it's a small world, I guess, I first heard about this book when Dee Dee from Brown Girl Reading did a read-along of this a couple of years ago, and it turns out that this is set 2 kilometers from my house. They describe the intersection where these characters live, and that's where it is. So it's hilarious to me that an American living in France told me about this book that's in my neighborhood. This follows 2 characters, Pierre and Vijay, who live in the same building and have a relationship that's mostly based on the fact that Pierre is taking a French cooking class and cooks for his neighbor. I've seen this book misdescribed as sitting within the romance genre, and it does not. It doesn't hit those points, and it doesn't have that ending. This is more like chick-lit, except that it's with men, so I don't know what you call the male version of chick-lit, but that's what this is. The 2 characters have a lot of confusion between each other, both in terms of what their expectations of each other are. At one point, Pierre is an American who moved to Canada to be with his boyfriend turned fiancé, who then cheated on him, and Vijay is a guy from Markham who is now living on his own, and his parents have some drama with him. As they're figuring each other out, they have some funny miscommunications, because Pierre at first assumes that Vijay is black rather than brown. Vijay assumes that Pierre must have a Caribbean background when he's American. There's some stuff like that. Pierre is gay, and Vijay says he's straight but seems to be flirting with him, so there's a lot of questioning that way. And that is all very entertaining. That is about the first half of the book. In the second half, Pierre gets back together with his cheating fiancé, and this is telegraphed to not be going to go well. So that wasn't great fun to read. There is also a huge amount of drama, of family secrets involving Vijay's family that I didn't 100% believe, just because this is in my neighborhood and I know how people talk about things like family backgrounds, and there are a lot of things where people on introduction would be asking questions that I don't want to spoil anything because there is a twist in this, but I didn't believe that his family secret and some of their relationships would have worked out this way, just because it was the kind of thing that people would gossip about. Because I actually have known people who either lie or exaggerate some heritage elements in the way that there's a situation in here where that happens, and it gets interrogated a lot because that's just how we talk about things here. So I didn't believe that his family secret would have played out the way it did, just because the conversation would be different. However, I was thoroughly entertained by the confused relationship between the 2 main characters. I really enjoyed the first half of this. I really enjoyed things like when they go shopping at the Metro at Kennedy Commons, because the day I read this, I had just been shopping at the Metro at Kennedy Commons, so I had a lot of fun with this. So even though I didn't buy the second half, this was his first novel. There's another one. I'm looking forward to picking that up. So yeah, I'm not unhappy, even though I didn't find the second half to be super believable, because it is a fun run around with these characters. And finally, I read a book that is not fun at all. And that is Shut Up You're Pretty by Tia Mutonji. I picked this up at Fold last year and just got around to reading it. I think it only just came out in the US and the UK The author is a Congolese-Canadian writer who writes in English, because usually if you hear about a Congolese-Canadian writer, they'll be writing in French. This is a book of short stories that reads like a novel because they are interconnected stories in the life of this main character. We meet her first in her early teens, where she makes friends with a girl who is using her precocious sexuality to gain favors and proceeds from there. It is very typical of a lot of Canadian literary fiction that is set in South Scarborough, like Catherine Hernandez's Scarborough, like David Cherry Andy's brother, in that it's very heavy on the let's talk about poverty and death and misery. It is very heavy on that. It's well done. I thought the first half of this was just brilliant, though, because it's not really a negative, except that it's a stereotype. But I mean, I do think it's kind of funny that if you want a more romantic comedy like the other book, or like Ismet Jalaluddin's Aisha at Last, you have to go further north, which, being from North Scarborough, amuses me, but at the same time, anyway, that doesn't really matter. What is my point here? So the first half of this follows the main character, her parents, her best friend, and some of the boys and girls that they become sexually involved with along the way, again, precociously in ways that are uncomfortable, and with a lot of background commentary on things beyond class, immigration, and culture. The main character is, like the author, Congolese, and goes to a francophone school, which a lot of the her friends who are in the Anglophone system don't necessarily understand, which is hilarious to me, because on BookTube a couple of years ago there were a number of people doing the education book tag, and I noticed some Anglo-Canadians in Ontario who clearly don't know the difference between the Francophone school system and French immersion, which is a program in the Anglophone school system. So I thought that was kind of recognizable. At around the halfway point of this, the stories start to feel less connected and more like a run of almost something that would be in a situational comedy, except it's the opposite of a comedy. It's depressing stories about exploitation, and on their own they aren't bad, but compared to the first half of this book, which I thought was just brilliant, it was a bit of a letdown. It was ordinary. It was, yes, these are short stories about how miserable it would be to live in poverty and not have a supportive family in the background for you. So I almost wished that this was, instead of a collection of short stories, a novella containing the first half of the stories, because they are all much more connected to each other, and then the later ones do feel, I mean, there's still points in the main character's life, but the connections were much finer. Felt like they didn't matter as much. I am going to say I've seen some glowing reviews for this from people who clearly misread the last chapter. I've seen no fewer than 5 people review this and give it 5 stars, who talk about the main character as moving to Canada at 14, and in the last chapter of this, she talks about the place where she lived off Victoria Park when she was 5 or 6 and they first moved there. So she didn't move at 14, she moved at 5 or 6. And it baffles me that people are giving this glowing reviews and misunderstanding a major fact that is reiterated in the final chapter. I was baffled going through Goodreads and a few videos and seeing that, because that's a big thing to misunderstand. So I wondered if they were reading this and just reacting emotionally and not thinking about the bits and pieces. And I think maybe I was reading it more narrowly because it is set not as local as the other book, but it is set in areas that I recognize, so I was looking out for finer points, maybe? I don't know. I just thought it was worth mentioning that people are misreading something that is so explicitly stated near the end of the book, because that seems strange to me. In any case, definitely worth picking up because the first half of it is just brilliant, and I look forward to seeing what the author writes next. And finally, I read some comics. I read Volume 2 of Crowded, which is written by Christopher Sebela, and I'll note the artists down below because there are a few of them. I have talked about Volume 1 before. This is a book that is set in a near future in which there is an app on which people can order hits on other people. And this is about a woman who's had a very high-priced bounty put on her head, so everyone's chasing her, and she hires this former Secret Service woman to protect her. And they kind of hate each other, but they have this on-the-run relationship. And this continues that. They continue on the run. As is telegraphed in the first one, they do hook up in this one, which is drawn in a way that's quite attractive, which is weird because the characters are annoying as anything. So they're not attractive characters, but they're drawn in an attractive way, which was weird. And which I was thinking about because I was reading the comments on Brian from Bookish did a chat about people who choose not to answer the bookish crush question, and so I had that in my head as I was reading this, and I was like, yeah, these are drawn in a, I don't know, quote-unquote sexy way, but the characters are so annoying. I liked this, I think, less than I liked the first one because the action scenes are good. I just became increasingly annoyed with these two characters and the fact that they're constantly asking each other the same questions, and I just didn't care in the end. So, like, yeah, I enjoyed seeing them parachute down a missile silo, but I just didn't care about any of the discussions. So, again, this is a book that I'm reading through the library on Hoopla. If I were paying for this, I would not continue with the series. But because I think the action scenes and the art are good, I will continue reading it. But yeah, I was less than impressed. I also read a graphic novel that's a bit of a booktube darling, and that is Mooncakes by Suzanne Walker and Wendy. This has just fantastically adorable art. I will insert some here. It's about a witch and a werewolf in their late teens trying to fight a demon together. And the witch lives with her two grandmothers who are also witches, and a lot of the setup is really cute. However, this is a setting in which the magic has no rules, and there's kind of a running joke about the fact that there are no rules. The two friends have another friend who is, I don't remember if she was an engineer or a physicist, but she's in some kind of program like that, and they mock her, and there's a joke about the grandmothers making fun of Einstein, and that's fine, but the magic doesn't make sense, and that irritated me to no end. Also, there's a story about the werewolf character's stepfather, and it's such a cliche of the evil step-parent that I almost couldn't believe how ridiculously simplistic that was. It just seemed ridiculous to me. So I was not the fan that a lot of people have been. I don't know if my expectations were too high because everybody has loved this, but yeah, I did not love it. And I wish I had, because such glowing reviews. I think a lot of people who are charmed by this are charmed by the romance at its core, which is cute and does include a lot of elements that I think for a younger audience are important to promote. The witch character is hard of hearing, and the werewolf character is non-binary, and I think for a younger audience that is important representation to see. The romance is cute, the art is cute. The stepfather is such a caricature of an evil step-parent that it seemed ridiculous to me. The magic with no rules was ridiculous to me. The fact that the characters seem like such... They really seem like young teenagers. They're not. They're meant to be in their late teens, I think, but the grandparents... But that the ghost of the witch's parents are disappointed that she still lives with the grandparents seemed ridiculous. Like, you're gonna kick your child out when she's... I don't know, that baffled me. So I don't know if I'm nitpicking because I didn't like some of these peripheral elements, but I really didn't like the peripheral elements. But if you are reading this exclusively for the romance or the art, I think it's probably lovely. If you don't like the evil step-parent cliche and you want your magic to have rules, you might feel the way I did. I don't know. Alright, yeah. So if you've read any of these, I'd love to hear what you thought. I know there were a couple in there that I did not love the way most people love them, so feel free to tell me how wrong I am in the comments below. Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.